I paid $60,000 for my stepson's wedding, a price I considered a small investment to see him finally become a responsible man. But during his toast, in front of 150 guests, he thanked my wife for finding an excellent financial partner and then pointed at me. He didn't see me as family, he saw me as a wallet. That night, I made a decision. He thought he was getting a job and a blank check. Instead, he was about to get a lesson in what happens when you humiliate the wrong man. If you've ever felt betrayed by family, subscribe so you don't miss the final, devastating outcome. And I'd love to know where this story is reaching you. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, the story begins. The Fairmont Grand Ballroom had never looked more elegant. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables dressed in white silk and gold accents, while a string quartet played classical music for the 150 guests I'd personally invited and paid for. Kevin stood at the altar in his custom-tailored tuxedo, waiting for Jessica to walk down the aisle scattered with rose petals that had cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. Everything was perfect, exactly as I'd planned when I'd agreed to finance this lavish celebration of what I hoped would be my stepson's transition into responsible adulthood. I'd paid for everything. The venue rental, Jessica's designer wedding dress, the 5-course dinner prepared by the city's most expensive catering company, the open bar stocked with premium liquor, and the live band that would play until midnight. The total cost approached $60,000, but I considered it an investment in Kevin's future and, by extension, the promise I'd made to my wife Laura. The promise was simple but significant. If Kevin could prove he was ready to settle down by marrying a good woman like Jessica, I would give him a position as marketing director at Morrison Industries, my successful consulting firm. The position came with a starting salary of $85,000, enough to finally allow Kevin to pay off the gambling debts I suspected he'd accumulated and begin building a legitimate adult life. For me, marriage represented commitment, responsibility, and the kind of maturity that qualified someone for executive authority in a business I'd spent 23 years building from nothing. For Kevin, I was beginning to understand, marriage was simply the key that unlocked access to a steady income he hadn't earned through education, experience, or demonstrated competence. "Richard, doesn't Kevin look handsome?" Laura whispered as we watched our son prepare to exchange vows with the young woman who'd captured his attention 6 months earlier. Laura's pride in Kevin was genuine but complicated. She knew her 24-year-old son had never held a job for longer than 4 months, had dropped out of college twice, and had been finding himself at my expense for the 3 years since she and I had married. But Laura also believed that love and financial support could eventually inspire Kevin to develop the work ethic and personal responsibility he'd never been required to demonstrate. "He looks nervous," I said to Laura, noting the way Kevin kept checking his phone during what should have been the most important ceremony of his life. The nervousness wasn't about commitment to Jessica, it was about whether his performance as a responsible husband-to-be would convince me to follow through with the job offer that would solve his financial problems while requiring minimal effort on his part. Jessica walked down the aisle in a gown that had required 3 fittings and cost more than I'd spent on my first car. She looked radiant, genuinely happy, completely unaware that her new husband viewed their marriage as a business transaction designed to access his stepfather's money. The ceremony was beautiful and traditional, exactly what Laura had dreamed of for her son. Kevin's vows spoke about building a future together, taking responsibility for their shared life, and becoming the man Jessica deserved. The words were appropriate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was reciting lines from a script rather than expressing genuine emotions. During the cocktail hour, Kevin worked the room with the practiced charm he'd developed during his brief, unsuccessful stint in sales. He introduced Jessica to business associates whose approval he needed for the marketing position I'd promised him, emphasizing his excitement about joining the Morrison Industries team and finally putting his communications degree to good use. The communications degree he'd never actually completed, from the university where he'd spent 2 years accumulating credit hours and beer-drinking stories before deciding that traditional education wasn't compatible with his entrepreneurial spirit. "Richard, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for Kevin and Jessica," said Margaret Whitfield, one of my longtime clients who'd attended the wedding at my invitation. "This is such a generous celebration of young love." "Kevin's family now," I replied to Margaret, though I was beginning to question whether Kevin understood what family meant beyond access to other people's resources and professional connections. The dinner was exceptional, exactly what you'd expect from a catering company that served Fortune 500 corporate events and high society fundraisers. Guests complimented the food, the service, and the elegance of the entire celebration, while Kevin accepted their praise as if he'd personally planned and financed his own wedding. But it was during the toasts that Kevin revealed what he really thought about the man who'd paid for his wedding, supported him through 3 years of unemployment and underemployment, and promised him a career opportunity he hadn't earned through his own efforts. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight to celebrate Jessica and me," Kevin began, standing at the microphone with a champagne flute and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I especially want to thank my mother, Laura, for always believing in me and for finding such an excellent financial partner," Kevin said, gesturing toward me with his glass. "Without Richard's wallet, none of this would have been possible." The ballroom fell silent except for the uncomfortable shuffling of chairs and nervous laughter from guests who weren't sure whether Kevin's comment was meant as humor or insult. Kevin continued with his toast, but I stopped hearing the words. The phrase, financial partner, echoed in my mind like a gong that wouldn't stop ringing. Not stepfather, not family member, not the man who'd welcomed him into my home and my business. Just a wallet, a source of funding for lifestyle choices he couldn't afford through his own labor. Laura's face had gone pale beside me, her eyes wide with mortification and recognition that Kevin had just publicly humiliated the man who'd been supporting him unconditionally for 3 years. She reached for my hand under the table, but I gently pulled away, maintaining the calm expression I'd perfected during decades of high-stakes business negotiations. The applause that followed Kevin's toast was polite but muted, the kind of response you give when you're not sure what you've just witnessed, but you know it wasn't entirely appropriate. Jessica looked confused and slightly hurt, probably wondering why her new husband had chosen their wedding reception as the venue for what felt like a calculated insult toward the man who'd made their celebration possible. I sat in that ballroom surrounded by friends and colleagues, watching Kevin bask in applause for a toast that had reduced me to a punchline, and realized that my 3 years of financial support and professional mentorship had taught him nothing about gratitude, respect, or the obligations that come with accepting other people's generosity. Kevin had just told a room full of people that I was nothing more than a source of money, a convenient ATM that his mother had married to fund his lifestyle and ambitions. The cruelty was breathtaking, but the accuracy was even more painful to acknowledge. As the evening continued with dancing and celebration, I maintained my composure while calculating exactly how much Kevin's public humiliation had cost me. Not just the $60,000 I'd spent on his wedding, but the years of support, encouragement, and professional opportunities I'd provided to someone who saw me as nothing more than a financial convenience. During the father-daughter dance, Kevin approached our table with Jessica at his side. "Richard, I hope you enjoyed my speech," Kevin said with the satisfied expression of someone who thought he'd been cleverly entertaining. "It was certainly memorable," I replied to Kevin, my voice carrying no emotion that might reveal what I was thinking or planning. "Jessica and I were talking about our honeymoon plans," Kevin continued. "We're thinking about extending our trip to Europe if you could advance me the first month's salary from my new position at Morrison Industries." The audacity was stunning. Kevin had just publicly humiliated me, and now he was asking for additional money before he'd worked a single day in the job I'd promised him. "We can discuss your employment arrangements when you return from your honeymoon," I said to Kevin, noting the flash of annoyance that crossed his face when I didn't immediately agree to his request. "I just thought that since we're family now, and since Jessica and I will have additional expenses as a married couple, we could expedite the paperwork," Kevin said. "Kevin, employment decisions should be based on qualifications and performance, not on family relationships or personal financial needs," I replied. Kevin's smile became forced, the expression of someone who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through charm and persistence, but was encountering unexpected resistance. "Of course, Richard. I just know how much you value family loyalty and how excited you are to have me join the company," Kevin said. Family loyalty. The phrase felt ironic coming from someone who just described me as his mother's financial partner in front of 150 wedding guests. Later that evening, as the reception wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, I made a decision that would change Kevin's understanding of family relationships permanently. I approached Jessica while Kevin was occupied with thanking the band and taking final photographs. "Jessica, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" I asked her. Of course, Mr. Morrison. I wanted to thank you again for this beautiful wedding, Jessica said with the genuine warmth of someone who'd been raised to appreciate generosity rather than expect it. We walked to a quiet corner of the ballroom where I handed her an envelope I'd prepared earlier that day. "This is a wedding gift that's separate from anything Kevin and I might have discussed," I said to Jessica. "Mr. Morrison, you've already been so generous. You really didn't need to give us anything else," Jessica replied. "This isn't for both of you. This is specifically for you. Please don't open it until you're alone, and please think carefully about what it contains," I said to Jessica. Jessica accepted the envelope with curiosity and gratitude, probably assuming it contained a check or savings bond that would help launch their married life together. What it actually contained was going to give Jessica the choice Kevin had never offered her, the opportunity to begin their marriage with complete honesty about who she'd married and why he'd really wanted to marry her. The choice between building a future with someone who saw her as part of his business plan, or starting over with the truth about what Kevin had been hiding from her since the day they'd met. The morning after Kevin's wedding, I woke at 5 a.m. with the clarity that comes from making a decision that's been building for months. The public humiliation had been the catalyst, but the real problem was much deeper than one cruel toast delivered to a ballroom full of witnesses. I'd been enabling Kevin's entitled behavior for 3 years, funding his lifestyle while telling myself I was investing in his potential. But Kevin had never shown potential for anything except spending other people's money and finding creative ways to avoid the responsibilities that came with accepting support. The first step in documenting exactly who Kevin really was required a conversation with my head of security, Michael Torres, who'd provided background checks on employees and business partners for Morrison Industries since 2018. "Michael, I need a comprehensive investigation into Kevin Walsh's financial activities, employment history, and personal associations," I told him during our meeting in my downtown office Monday morning. "Mr. Morrison, what specifically are you looking for?" Michael asked, opening his laptop to begin taking notes. "I want to know where Kevin's been getting money when he's not working, who he's been associating with when he claims to be job hunting, and what financial obligations he might have that would explain his sudden urgency about marriage and employment," I explained. Michael had conducted hundreds of similar investigations for business purposes, but this was personal in a way that made me uncomfortable. I was investigating my stepson like I'd investigate a potential embezzler or fraudulent business partner. "Mr. Morrison, do you suspect Kevin of criminal activity, or are you just trying to understand his character and motivations?" Michael asked. "I suspect Kevin of being systematically dishonest about his financial situation and his reasons for wanting to marry Jessica and join my company," I replied. "Whether that dishonesty rises to the level of criminal activity is what I need you to determine." Over the next few days, Michael's investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that explained everything about Kevin's timeline and desperation to access my money through marriage and employment. "Mr. Morrison, Kevin Walsh has been gambling regularly at 3 different casinos in the metro area," Michael reported during our follow-up meeting Thursday afternoon. "He's accumulated approximately $47,000 in debt to various creditors, including some individuals who don't use traditional collection methods." The euphemism was clear. Kevin owed money to loan sharks who expected payment regardless of his employment status or family connections. "Michael, how long has this been going on?" I asked. "Based on credit records and witness statements, Kevin's been gambling heavily since before you married his mother. The debt has been accumulating steadily, with recent acceleration suggesting desperation or addiction," Michael said. Michael showed me photographs of Kevin entering and leaving gambling establishments during hours when he'd claimed to be job hunting or attending business networking events. Time-stamped images that proved he'd been lying to Laura and me about how he spent his days. "There's more, Mr. Morrison. Kevin's been telling people at the casinos that he's about to inherit a significant amount of money and receive a high-paying job through family connections," Michael continued. "What kind of people has he been talking to?" I asked. "Professional gamblers, loan sharks, and other individuals who've been extending him credit based on his claims about upcoming family financial support," Michael explained. Kevin hadn't just been gambling with money he didn't have. He'd been gambling with promises about money he expected to receive from me after his marriage to Jessica legitimized his claim to a position at Morrison Industries. "Michael, what happens if Kevin can't pay these debts?" I asked. "Based on my conversations with people familiar with his creditors, Kevin's physical safety becomes an issue if he doesn't make substantial payments within the next 60 days, Michael said. The timeline explained everything. Kevin's rush to marry Jessica, his confidence about receiving the marketing director position, His assumption that I would advance him salary before he'd worked a single day. He wasn't planning for a career. He was planning to use my money to avoid violence from people who don't negotiate payment plans. But Michael's investigation revealed something even more disturbing about Kevin's relationship with Jessica and his understanding of marriage as a business transaction. Mr. Morrison, Kevin has been telling people that Jessica comes from a wealthy family and that her father owns several successful restaurants, Michael said, showing me social media posts and witness statements Kevin had made about his bride's supposed financial background. Jessica's father manages a single restaurant. He doesn't own anything except the house he's been paying off for 22 years, I said to Michael. Kevin's been representing Jessica's family situation very differently. He's told creditors that marriage to Jessica provides access to two sources of family wealth, her father's restaurant business and your business interests, Michael explained. Kevin had been lying about Jessica's family wealth the same way he'd been lying about his own employment prospects and gambling problems. He'd manipulated her into marriage based on fantasies about both their financial backgrounds. Michael, does Jessica know about Kevin's gambling debts or his misrepresentations about her family's financial situation? I asked. Based on my interviews with her friends and coworkers, Jessica believes Kevin is temporarily unemployed but actively job hunting. She's been supporting him financially through her work as a marketing coordinator while planning their wedding, Michael said. Jessica had been paying Kevin's living expenses with her own salary while he'd been gambling away money borrowed against promises about my future support. She'd married someone who saw her as a prop in his scheme to access other people's money. The investigation also revealed details about Kevin's employment history that explained why he'd never held a job for longer than 4 months. Not lack of skills or bad luck with employers, but a pattern of behavior that made him unemployable in any position requiring responsibility or integrity. Kevin's been fired from 4 jobs in the past 2 years, Michael reported. Reasons include showing up late consistently, making personal phone calls during work hours, and in one case, asking customers for personal loans to cover what he described as family emergencies. Kevin had been using his employment as opportunities to solve his financial problems through inappropriate relationships with coworkers and customers. The pattern explained why legitimate employers wouldn't hire him and why he viewed my job offer as his only option for regular income. But the most damaging information Michael uncovered was evidence that Kevin had been planning to use his position at Morrison Industries for purposes that had nothing to do with marketing or business development. Mr. Morrison, Kevin's been telling people that working for you would give him access to your client list and financial information, Michael said. He suggested that your consulting business handles wealthy clients who might be interested in investment opportunities. What kind of investment opportunities? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Kevin's been researching cryptocurrency schemes, multi-level marketing programs, and other high-risk investments that he could promote to your clients using his position at Morrison Industries as credibility, Michael explained. Kevin hadn't just been planning to use my company for steady income, he'd been planning to exploit my client relationships and professional reputation to fund get-rich-quick schemes that would solve his gambling debts while potentially destroying the business I'd spent decades building. The investigation was complete, but the education was just beginning. Kevin was about to learn that actions have consequences, that lies have expiration dates, and that some people are too smart to be manipulated indefinitely. I had given Jessica an envelope containing everything Michael had discovered about Kevin's gambling, his debts, his lies about her family's wealth, and his plans to exploit our marriage for access to money and business opportunities he hadn't earned. But I'd also given Jessica something Kevin had never offered her, a choice based on complete honesty about who she'd married and why he'd really wanted to marry her. The choice between continuing a marriage built on lies or starting over with the truth about what Kevin had been hiding since the day they'd met. By Saturday morning, Kevin would discover whether Jessica valued honesty enough to leave a husband who'd seen her as a business transaction rather than a person deserving of love and respect. Jessica opened the envelope in her hotel room Saturday morning while Kevin was still sleeving off the champagne and celebration from their wedding reception. What she found inside changed her understanding of the man she'd married and the life she'd committed to building with him. The envelope contained Michael Torres's complete investigation report, including photographs of Kevin entering and leaving gambling establishments, documentation of his $47,000 in debt to loan sharks, and transcripts of conversations where he described their marriage as his access to two sources of family wealth that didn't actually exist. But the envelope also contained something else, a first-class airline ticket to any destination of Jessica's choice, valid for 12 months, along with contact information for a women's advocacy attorney who specialized in helping people escape marriages based on fraud and deception. The note I'd included was simple and direct. Jessica, Kevin married you to solve financial problems he created through gambling addiction. He's been lying about your family's wealth, his own employment prospects, and his reasons for wanting this marriage. You deserve a husband who loves you for who you are, not what he thinks you can provide access to. This ticket represents a choice Kevin never gave you. The choice to start your marriage with complete honesty, or start your life over with the truth about what he's been hiding. The decision is entirely yours. Jessica sat in that hotel room for 3 hours, reading through documentation that revealed the man she'd married the day before had been systematically lying to her about everything that mattered. His financial situation, his employment history, his family background, and most painfully, his reasons for pursuing their relationship. According to friends who spoke with her later, Jessica's first reaction wasn't anger, but heartbreak. She genuinely loved Kevin, believed in his potential, and looked forward to building a life together based on mutual support and shared values. The investigation revealed that Kevin had never shared her values or supported her goals. He'd been using her salary to fund his gambling, while telling creditors that marriage to her would provide access to restaurant wealth that didn't exist and business opportunities he hadn't earned. Jessica's second reaction was practical recognition that staying married to Kevin would mean inheriting responsibility for debts she hadn't created, involvement with creditors who used violence for collection, and participation in a marriage that had been a business transaction from Kevin's perspective. But Jessica's final reaction was the one that determined Kevin's education about the consequences of treating marriage as a financial scheme rather than a commitment based on love and honesty. Jessica wrote a letter to Kevin explaining that she'd learned the truth about his gambling, his debts, and his lies about both their families' financial situations. She couldn't begin a marriage with someone who saw her as part of a business plan rather than a person deserving of love and respect. She packed her belongings, left the letter on Kevin's pillow, and took the morning flight to San Diego, where her college roommate had been offering her a job in marketing that paid better than her current position and didn't require supporting a husband who'd been lying about fundamental aspects of his character. Kevin woke up Saturday afternoon to find his bride gone, and a letter that destroyed his assumptions about controlling the narrative of their marriage and his access to the money he'd been counting on to solve his gambling problems. The phone call came at 2:04 p.m. while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my home office. Kevin's voice was strangled with panic and rage when I answered. "Richard, what did you do?" Kevin screamed. "Jessica's gone. She left me a letter saying she knows about everything, and it's your fault." "Kevin, what does Jessica know about?" I asked calmly, as if I hadn't provided her with detailed documentation of his lies and schemes. "You know what she knows. You gave her something at the wedding, didn't you? You sabotaged my marriage." Kevin's voice was getting higher and more desperate with each word. "Kevin, I gave Jessica information about your gambling debts, your lies about her family's wealth, and your plan to use marriage as access to money you hadn't earned," I replied. "If that sabotaged your marriage, then your marriage was based on deception rather than love." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Kevin to process that his stepfather had been investigating him and had chosen to expose his lies to his new wife rather than continue enabling his manipulative behavior. "Richard, you don't understand what you've done," Kevin said, his voice dropping to something between a whisper and a threat. "I owe money to people who don't care about family problems or marriage difficulties." "Kevin, you owe money to people because you've been gambling with borrowed funds while lying to everyone about your employment prospects and family connections," I corrected. "But I had a plan. Jessica and I were going to move in with you and Laura while I started at Morrison Industries. My salary would have covered the minimum payments while I got back on my feet," Kevin explained, as if systematic deception was reasonable long-term planning. "Kevin, your plan was to use fraud to solve problems you created through addiction. That's not planning, that's criminal behavior," I said. Kevin's breathing became audible through the phone as he realized that his scheme had not only failed, but had been deliberately destroyed by the person he'd expected to fund it. "Richard, you have to help me fix this. Call Jessica, explain that there was a misunderstanding, offer to pay for marriage counseling or a second honeymoon," Kevin said, desperation replacing anger in his voice. "Kevin, there was no misunderstanding. Jessica learned the truth about who she married and decided she deserved better than a husband who saw her as a business opportunity, I replied. But what am I supposed to do about the money I owe? These people aren't going to wait while I figure out another plan, Kevin said. Kevin, you're going to have to figure out legal solutions to problems you created through illegal gambling and fraudulent representations to creditors, I said. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Kevin alternating between threats, pleas, and attempts to negotiate some kind of financial support that would allow him to avoid the consequences of his gambling addiction and systematic dishonesty. But I'd already made my decision about Kevin's future role in my family and my business. His public humiliation at the wedding reception had been the catalyst, but his response to Jessica's departure revealed the depth of his entitlement and his inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of his own choices. That evening, Laura confronted me about Jessica's departure and Kevin's accusations that I'd deliberately sabotaged his marriage. "Richard," Kevin called me crying, saying, "You gave Jessica information that made her leave him," Laura said as we sat in the living room where I'd first met her son and decided to support his transition into responsible adulthood. "Laura, I gave Jessica the truth about Kevin's gambling addiction, his debts, and his lies about both families' financial situations," I replied. "But why would you interfere in their marriage? If Kevin has problems, shouldn't we help him work through them as a family?" Laura asked. "Laura, Kevin's problems aren't family issues, they're criminal issues. He owes $47,000 to loan sharks because he's been gambling with money borrowed against promises about my future support," I explained. I showed Laura the investigation report Michael Torres had prepared, including photographs of Kevin entering casinos during hours when he'd claimed to be job hunting and documentation of his lies to creditors about both families' wealth. Laura read through the evidence with growing horror and recognition. "Richard, I had no idea Kevin's problems were this serious," she said. "Laura, Kevin's been lying to both of us about his activities, his debts, and his reasons for wanting to marry Jessica and work for my company," I said. "He's been using our support to fund gambling addiction while building a lifestyle based on money he expected to receive from me after marriage legitimized his claim to employment he hadn't earned," I continued. Laura's face crumpled as she processed that her son hadn't just been irresponsible or immature, he'd been systematically deceptive and manipulative toward everyone who tried to help him. "What happens now?" Laura asked. "Now Kevin learns that actions have consequences, that lies have expiration dates, and that some people are too smart to be manipulated indefinitely," I replied. "And what happens to us?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at this woman I'd married because I'd thought I could love her son into becoming a better person, because I'd believed that financial support and professional opportunity could inspire character development in someone who'd never been required to demonstrate integrity or work ethic. "That depends on whether you're willing to accept that Kevin's problems require professional intervention rather than family enablement," I said to Laura. "And whether you can understand that protecting Jessica from a marriage based on lies was more important than preserving Kevin's access to money he hadn't earned through honest work," I continued. Sunday morning brought news that Kevin's creditors weren't willing to wait for him to develop alternative payment plans. Laura received a call from the hospital informing her that Kevin had been admitted to the emergency room with injuries consistent with a serious beating. The lesson about gambling with other people's money and lying to dangerous people was being delivered more directly than I'd anticipated, but with the same educational value. Kevin needed to understand the real consequences of the choices he'd been making for years. Some education can only be provided through complete consequences, delivered by people who don't accept excuses or negotiate payment plans based on family connections or future employment prospects. Kevin was about to discover that stealing money through fraud and deception has costs that extend far beyond losing access to the people you've been exploiting. Kevin's hospitalization lasted 4 days, during which time Laura maintained a constant vigil at his bedside while I handled the business of protecting our family from the criminal associates whose money Kevin had been gambling away for months. The injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. 2 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and facial bruising that would take weeks to heal completely. The message from Kevin's creditors was clear, without being fatal: pay what you owe or face escalating consequences that wouldn't be limited to the person who'd borrowed the money. "Mr. Morrison, your stepson's situation affects your family's safety," Detective Williams, from the Organized Crime Unit, explained during our meeting at police headquarters Tuesday morning. The people Kevin owes money to don't distinguish between him and his relatives when it comes to collecting debts. What kind of protection can you provide? I asked Detective Williams. Limited. These are sophisticated operations that use intimidation and violence as business tools. They stay within legal boundaries while making their expectations clear, he said. Your best protection is eliminating their motivation to target your family. Eliminating their motivation meant either paying Kevin's gambling debts or ensuring that Kevin was no longer associated with our family in ways that made us attractive targets for creditor harassment. I chose the second option. Wednesday afternoon, I visited Kevin in his hospital room while Laura was meeting with doctors about his discharge and recovery timeline. Kevin looked smaller in the hospital bed, his face still swollen from the beating he'd received, but his attitude toward me hadn't improved despite his circumstances. "Richard, you need to pay these people before they come after Laura or target your business," Kevin said without any greeting or acknowledgement that his own choices had created the danger he was now asking me to solve. "Kevin, I need you to understand something clearly," I replied. "I'm not going to pay your gambling debts, I'm not going to employ you at Morrison Industries, and I'm not going to continue supporting your lifestyle while you make increasingly dangerous choices." Kevin struggled to sit up in the hospital bed, wincing from pain that was a direct result of borrowing money from people who don't negotiate payment plans. "Richard, you can't just abandon me now. I'm family. I'm Laura's son," Kevin said, playing the relationship card that had worked for 3 years but was no longer effective. "Kevin, family members don't publicly humiliate each other at wedding receptions," I replied. "They don't lie about gambling addictions while accepting financial support from people trying to help them. They don't marry people under false pretenses or plan to exploit business relationships for personal financial schemes," I continued. Kevin's face reddened with anger and desperation. "You investigated me like I was some kind of criminal instead of treating me like family who needed help," he said. "Kevin, you were acting like a criminal, lying about your activities, misrepresenting your financial situation, and planning to defraud my clients through your position at my company," I replied. I pulled out a folder containing documents that would formalize Kevin's separation from my family and my business permanently. "Kevin, I'm terminating my financial support for you effective immediately. I'm revoking my offer of employment at Morrison Industries, and I'm changing my will to remove any provisions that would benefit you or your mother," I said. Kevin stared at the legal documents with growing horror as he realized that his beating had been just the beginning of consequences that would follow him long after his physical injuries healed. "You can't do this to my mother because of my mistakes," Kevin said, his voice breaking with the recognition that his actions had destroyed not only his own prospects, but Laura's financial security. "Kevin, your mother enabled your gambling addiction by accepting your lies and pressuring me to provide financial support you hadn't earned," I said. "She chose to believe your stories about job hunting instead of questioning why you never found employment. She chose to support your marriage to Jessica without investigating whether you were being honest about your reasons for wanting to get married," I continued. Kevin tried to argue, but I continued explaining the legal changes I'd already implemented to protect my business and personal assets from his creditors and future schemes. "The house Laura and I live in is being transferred to a trust that excludes both of you. Morrison Industries is being restructured to prevent any claims based on family relationships. My personal assets are being protected through legal mechanisms that you can't access through inheritance or legal proceedings," I said to Kevin. "You're destroying our family because I made some bad choices," Kevin said. "Kevin, I'm protecting myself and my business from someone who's been systematically lying and stealing while pretending to be family who deserves support," I replied. That evening, Laura confronted me about the legal changes I'd implemented while Kevin was recovering from his beating. "Richard, Kevin made mistakes, but cutting us off completely seems extreme," Laura said as we sat in the living room where we'd planned our marriage 3 years earlier. "He's learned his lesson. The beating, losing Jessica, facing his gambling debts, isn't that punishment enough?" "Laura, Kevin hasn't learned any lessons. His first response to getting beaten for gambling debts was to demand that I pay them," I replied. "His second response was to claim that I'm destroying our family instead of acknowledging that he destroyed our family through years of lies and manipulation," I continued. I showed Laura the evidence that Kevin had been planning to use his position at Morrison Industries to promote investment schemes to my clients, potentially destroying my business reputation and professional relationships. "Laura, Kevin's problems aren't mistakes or bad luck. They're character issues that have been developing for years while we enabled his behavior through financial support and excuses, I said. But Richard, what happens to us, to our marriage? Laura asked, her voice trembling with the recognition that supporting her son's lies had cost her the relationship with me that had provided stability and financial security. I looked at this woman I'd married because I'd believed I could help her raise her son into a responsible adult, because I'd thought that love and financial support could overcome years of poor parenting and entitlement training. Laura, that depends on whether you're willing to accept that Kevin needs professional addiction treatment instead of family financial support, I said, and whether you can understand that protecting Jessica from a fraudulent marriage was more important than enabling Kevin's access to money he planned to steal through lies, I continued. Laura was quiet for several minutes, processing the choice between supporting her son's continued manipulation or preserving her marriage to someone who'd been generous but had limits to his tolerance for deception. "What would you need from me to consider rebuilding our relationship?" Laura asked finally. "Complete honesty about Kevin's problems and your role in enabling them. Participation in family therapy that addresses codependency and manipulation patterns. And acceptance that Kevin will receive no further financial support from me regardless of his circumstances," I replied. Laura nodded slowly, understanding that her relationship with me depended on choosing healthy boundaries over family loyalty that enabled destructive behavior. A week later, Jessica called me from San Diego to thank me for giving her the choice to leave Kevin before their marriage became legally and financially complicated by his gambling debts and creditor problems. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted you to know that I'm grateful you told me the truth about Kevin," Jessica said. "I really thought I loved him, but I was loving someone who didn't exist." "Jessica, Kevin's gambling addiction and dishonesty aren't your fault or your responsibility," I replied. "I know that now. The job here is going well, and I'm starting to understand how much Kevin was affecting my mental health and financial stability," Jessica said. Jessica explained that Kevin had been borrowing money from her credit cards without her knowledge, had been lying about job interviews that were actually gambling sessions, and had been making financial commitments in both their names that she'd only discovered after leaving him. "Mr. Morrison, can I ask you something?" Jessica said. "Of course. How long did you know Kevin was lying about everything?" she asked. "I suspected Kevin was being dishonest about his activities and motivations for months," I replied, "but I didn't have proof until I hired a private investigator to document his gambling and debts." "Why didn't you just confront him directly instead of investigating him?" Jessica asked. "Because Kevin had been lying so successfully for so long that confronting him without evidence would have resulted in more lies and manipulation," I said. "You deserve to know the truth about who you were marrying, and I deserve to know the truth about who I was supporting financially." Jessica thanked me again for protecting her from a marriage that would have destroyed her financial stability and mental health while funding Kevin's gambling addiction and creditor obligations. 2 months later, Kevin was arrested for credit card fraud related to unauthorized charges he'd made using Jessica's financial information during their brief marriage. The charges carried a potential sentence of 3 to 5 years in state prison, depending on his criminal history and cooperation with investigators. Laura filed for divorce from me 6 weeks after Kevin's arrest, citing irreconcilable differences related to my lack of support for her son during his most difficult period. The divorce settlement gave her enough money to start over somewhere else, but not enough to continue funding Kevin's legal defense or gambling debts. Kevin's education about the consequences of treating family relationships as financial opportunities was complete. He'd lost his wife, his access to my business and financial support, his mother's marriage to someone who could have helped him build a legitimate career, and his freedom. Some people only learn through complete consequences, delivered by people who refuse to enable destructive behavior regardless of family relationships or emotional manipulation. Kevin had learned that gambling with other people's money has costs that extend far beyond losing access to the people you've been exploiting. That lies have expiration dates, and that some people are too smart to be manipulated indefinitely. The lesson had been expensive but necessary, worth every dollar spent investigating him and every relationship sacrificed to teach it properly. 3 years after Kevin's sentencing for credit card fraud, I received news that he was being released early due to good behavior and participation in prison addiction treatment programs. The notification came through the Victim Services Department, along with information about a restitution hearing where Kevin would be required to face the people he'd defrauded. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in November, in the same courthouse where Kevin had been sentenced after pleading guilty to charges that included fraudulent use of Jessica's financial information and misrepresentation to multiple creditors about his family's wealth. I arrived early and sat in the gallery watching Kevin enter the courtroom wearing the standard-issue clothing of someone transitioning from prison back to civilian life. He looked older and genuinely humbled by experiences that had taught him about consequences in ways that family support and second chances never could. "Mr. Morrison, Kevin Walsh has requested permission to address you directly as part of his court-mandated restitution program," the Victim Services Coordinator explained. "You're not required to participate, but the court believes direct communication between offenders and victims can be beneficial for rehabilitation." I agreed to hear what Kevin had to say, curious whether prison had taught him anything meaningful about the difference between manipulation and genuine remorse. "Richard, thank you for giving me the chance to apologize," Kevin said when we met in the courthouse conference room. "I wanted to tell you that you were right about everything you said about my character and my behavior." Kevin explained that prison addiction counseling had helped him understand how gambling addiction had justified increasingly manipulative behavior toward everyone who tried to help him. "I spent years telling myself that I deserved your support because I was Laura's son, and that lying about my problems was protecting the people I loved," Kevin said. "Prison taught me that lying about addiction doesn't protect anyone, and that manipulation disguised as family need destroys relationships instead of preserving them," he continued. Kevin's apology seemed genuine, but I'd learned to distinguish between remorse motivated by consequences and remorse motivated by understanding. "Kevin, what specifically do you understand now that you didn't understand when you were gambling away borrowed money and lying to everyone about your activities?" I asked. "I understand that you weren't obligated to support me financially just because you married my mother," Kevin said. "I understand that employment opportunities should be earned through competence and character, not inherited through family relationships. I understand that Jessica deserved honesty about who she was marrying, and that protecting her from a fraudulent marriage was more important than protecting my access to money I hadn't earned," Kevin continued. The insight was correct, but came at a cost of 3 years in prison, the destruction of his marriage and family relationships, and the loss of every opportunity I'd offered him before his gambling addiction had made him unemployable. During the restitution hearing, Kevin was ordered to make monthly payments toward the financial damage he'd caused, though the amounts were small given his employment prospects as a convicted felon with no legitimate work experience. "Kevin Walsh will pay $200 monthly for the next 10 years to compensate victims of his fraudulent activities," Judge Patterson announced. "Failure to maintain payments will result in additional prison time." $200 a month for 10 years. Less than the cost of the wedding cake I'd paid for at his reception, but probably more than Kevin would be able to earn consistently given his criminal record and history of employment problems. After the hearing, I received updates about Kevin's adjustment to civilian life through the probation office. He was living in a halfway house, working construction jobs when available, and attending mandatory Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice weekly. The reports suggested genuine effort to rebuild his life through honest work, but they also revealed the lasting consequences of his choices. Employers were reluctant to hire someone with fraud convictions. Landlords refused rental applications from people with recent prison records. Even his construction work was intermittent and poorly paid. 6 months after his release, Laura contacted me for the first time since our divorce. She was remarrying and moving to Arizona, but wanted to discuss Kevin's situation before she left town completely. "Richard, I know I have no right to ask you for anything after what happened between us," Laura said during our phone conversation. "But Kevin is struggling to find stable employment and housing. He's trying to stay clean, but the obstacles are overwhelming." "Laura, what specifically are you asking from me?" I said. "Nothing financial, I know that's over permanently," Laura replied, "but maybe a letter of recommendation for employment or a reference that shows Kevin has family support for his recovery." The request was reasonable but complicated. Kevin had genuinely changed his behavior, but recommending him for employment would make me partially responsible for his future performance and choices. "Laura, I can't provide employment recommendations for someone who planned to defraud my clients and stole money from his wife," I said. "But I can acknowledge that Kevin has served his sentence and appears committed to recovery." Laura thanked me for even that limited acknowledgement, recognizing that Kevin's rehabilitation would have to be accomplished through his own efforts rather than through family connections or character references from people he'd betrayed. A year after Kevin's release, I established the Morrison Foundation for Financial Literacy, using money that had originally been designated for Kevin and Laura in my will. The foundation provided gambling addiction counseling, financial education, and support for families dealing with manipulation disguised as family need. Mr. Morrison, your experience with family financial exploitation has helped us develop programs that teach people to recognize manipulation before it destroys relationships, the foundation director reported during our first quarterly meeting. The foundation was serving over 50 families in its initial year, providing resources that helped people establish healthy boundaries around money and support while still maintaining genuine family relationships. Kevin's attempt to exploit our family relationship for gambling money was being converted into resources that helped other families avoid similar exploitation while supporting recovery for people genuinely committed to overcoming addiction. 2 years after his release, Kevin sent me a brief letter updating me about his progress and acknowledging the permanent nature of consequences for his choices. Richard, I wanted you to know that I'm still attending GA meetings and working construction when I can find jobs. I'm not asking for anything, just letting you know that I understand why you had to cut me off completely, Kevin wrote. I destroyed every opportunity you gave me and betrayed everyone who tried to help me. I accept that those choices have permanent consequences that follow me regardless of how much I've changed, the letter continued. Kevin's acceptance of permanent consequences was appropriate, but I wondered whether he truly understood the difference between earning forgiveness and expecting restoration of damaged relationships. The foundation continued expanding its programs, reaching families who might not otherwise seek help for financial manipulation and gambling addiction issues. Each success story represented prevention of the kind of family destruction that Kevin's choices had caused in our lives. But success stories couldn't undo the relationships that had been damaged permanently by years of systematic lying and manipulation. Some consequences couldn't be reversed through good behavior or adequate apologies. Kevin was learning that lesson slowly, through the daily experience of rebuilding a life with limited opportunities and damaged credibility. The education was ongoing and would continue for the rest of his life, regardless of how completely he recovered from gambling addiction or how genuinely he'd changed his character. 5 years after Kevin's wedding toast that had destroyed our family relationships, I received a letter that made the complete transformation of his attempted manipulation into something meaningful. The letter was from Jessica, now living in Portland and working as a senior marketing director for a sustainable energy company. She was writing to thank me for giving her the choice to leave Kevin before their marriage became legally and financially entangled with his gambling debts and criminal behavior. Mr. Morrison, I wanted you to know that leaving Kevin was the best decision I've ever made, Jessica wrote. The job opportunities and financial stability I've built wouldn't have been possible if I'd stayed married to someone whose addiction was consuming everything around him. Jessica explained that she'd met someone who shared her values about honest work and financial responsibility, and they were planning a wedding based on love rather than access to other people's resources. I think about that envelope you gave me sometimes, and how different my life would be if you hadn't cared enough to tell me the truth about who I was marrying, her letter continued. I was reading Jessica's letter in my study when my assistant announced that Patricia, the woman I'd been dating for 6 months, had arrived for dinner. Patricia was a successful architect whose adult children had built their own careers and maintained healthy relationships with money and family support. Richard, you look pleased about something, Patricia said as we settled into the dining room where Laura and I had once planned Kevin's future employment at Morrison Industries. I got a letter from Jessica, Kevin's ex-wife. She's doing well and thanked me for helping her avoid a marriage that would have destroyed her financial stability, I told Patricia. Patricia nodded with understanding that came from her own experience raising children who'd learned to earn what they received rather than expecting family support as an entitlement. It sounds like you saved her from years of enabling someone else's destructive choices, Patricia said. That kind of marriage destroys both people, not just the person with the addiction. 6 months later, Patricia and I married in a simple ceremony attended by friends and family members who understood the difference between love and financial manipulation. The celebration was elegant but modest, paid for by both of us as a demonstration of partnership rather than dependence. During our reception, Patricia's daughter Sarah gave a toast that thanked everyone who'd supported their family through difficult times, but made no reference to anyone's financial contributions or wallet-related qualities. Mom and Richard, thank you for showing us what healthy relationships look like, Sarah said. Relationships based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection rather than financial convenience or family obligation. The contrast with Kevin's wedding toast was striking and healing. Patricia's children treated me as their mother's husband, who deserved respect and kindness, not as a financial resource to be cultivated and exploited. 2 years after our wedding, I received the final communication I would ever have with Kevin. He was writing to inform me that he'd completed his restitution payments and wanted to acknowledge the permanent nature of consequences for his choices. Richard, I wanted you to know that I finished paying back the money I stole, and I understand that this doesn't change anything between us, Kevin wrote. I destroyed every opportunity you gave me and betrayed everyone who tried to help me. I accept that those choices have permanent consequences that follow me regardless of how much I've changed. I'm not asking for forgiveness or restoration of our relationship. I just wanted you to know that I understand why you had to protect yourself and others from what I was doing, the letter continued. Kevin's acceptance of permanent consequences was appropriate and necessary. He'd learned that some relationships can't be repaired through good behavior or adequate apologies, and that some education about character and consequences is permanent regardless of how completely someone changes. The Morrison Foundation for Financial Literacy had grown into a comprehensive program serving over 800 families dealing with gambling addiction, financial manipulation, and boundary issues within family relationships. Mr. Morrison, your willingness to share your experience has helped us reach families who might not otherwise recognize financial manipulation disguised as family love, the Foundation director reported during our annual meeting. The Foundation had helped families establish healthy financial boundaries, provided gambling addiction treatment for people genuinely committed to recovery, and created educational programs that taught people to distinguish between supporting family members and enabling their destructive behavior. Kevin's attempt to exploit our family relationship for gambling money had been converted into resources that prevented similar exploitation in hundreds of other families while supporting legitimate recovery efforts. Some evenings, when Patricia and I were reviewing Foundation reports about families who'd been helped by programs funded with money that would have enabled Kevin's continued gambling and manipulation, I felt a sense of purpose that hadn't existed when I'd been trying to love someone into becoming a better person. Kevin's education about consequences had been expensive but necessary. He'd learned that family relationships require ongoing trust and respect, not periodic apologies for repeated betrayals. That employment opportunities should be earned rather than inherited through family connections. That marriage should be based on love and shared values rather than financial convenience and access to other people's resources. Most importantly, Kevin had learned that some people are too intelligent to be manipulated indefinitely, and that some consequences are permanent regardless of how much someone claims to have changed or how completely they recover from addiction. 3 years later, I was invited to speak at a conference for families dealing with gambling addiction and financial manipulation. The audience included parents struggling with the balance between supporting adult children and enabling destructive behavior. The hardest lesson I learned was that love doesn't mean accepting lies and manipulation from family members, I told the audience. Sometimes love means setting boundaries that protect everyone involved, even when those boundaries feel cruel to the person whose behavior has made them necessary. I explained how Kevin's public humiliation at his wedding reception had been a catalyst for recognizing patterns of entitlement and manipulation that had been developing for years while family members had enabled his behavior through financial support and excuses. Kevin's gambling addiction was real, but it didn't excuse systematic lying to family members, fraudulent marriage to gain access to money, or plans to exploit business relationships for personal financial schemes, I continued. The conference attendees understood the complexity of loving someone whose addiction had made them manipulative and dangerous to the people trying to help them. Many shared similar stories about adult children who'd used family relationships as sources of funding for gambling, drug addiction, or irresponsible lifestyle choices that required constant financial rescue. The question isn't whether we love our family members, I concluded. The question is whether we love them enough to let them face the consequences that might teach them to make better choices. After the conference, I received dozens of letters from parents who'd been struggling with similar decisions about adult children whose problems had escalated beyond what family support could address. The letters confirmed that Kevin's story wasn't unique, but that my response to his manipulation had provided a model for other families dealing with exploitation disguised as need. Some people only learn through complete consequences, delivered by people who refuse to enable destructive behavior regardless of family relationships or emotional manipulation. Kevin had learned that gambling with other people's money and lying to family members has costs that extend far beyond losing access to the people you've been exploiting. That manipulation disguised as family love destroys relationships instead of preserving them. That some mistakes have permanent consequences that follow you regardless of how much you change. The lesson had been worth every relationship sacrificed to teach it, every dollar redirected from enabling his addiction to helping other families recognize and resist similar exploitation. Some education can only be provided by people who understand the difference between supporting someone and destroying yourself to fund their irresponsible choices. I hope this story touched you, especially those protecting themselves and their resources from family members who see relationships as opportunities for financial gain rather than connections based on mutual respect and genuine affection. If this story moved you, please support our channel with a like and subscribe for more stories about family manipulation, financial boundaries, and the courage to protect what you've built from those who would exploit your love and generosity. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts, or let us know where you're listening from around the world. These stories about family, money, and protecting yourself from exploitation connect people across all cultures and communities. Thank you for joining this journey through family betrayal, financial manipulation, and the wisdom that comes from understanding the difference between supporting someone and enabling their destructive behavior toward others and themselves. Until next time, remember, the most valuable lesson isn't about money or inheritance, but about recognizing when love is being used as a weapon against you and having the strength to protect yourself and others from people who mistake your generosity for weakness.